Some prisoners die dreaming about the moment their feet will touch free ground, but not me. I was the only prisoner who didn't want to get out of prison. I know that you might be curious to know what the charge was that landed me up in prison, but I don't even have an answer for that, as I was put in prison without one. Even though I spent most of my life in prison, I didn't stay in there forever. My family and friends are all in prison, but that did not necessarily mean that I had to stay there as well. It took a lot of guts for me to get out of prison, but going back in, without a doubt, even harder to do. My mom was only 16 when she went to prison, a mere single moment that turned her life upside down. All her dreams vanished into thin air when she pointed a gun at a burglar that broke into her house to scare him off. It was her first time to ever hold a gun, and she didn't know how to use it. All she knew was that her mom had put the gun in her hands. She was terrified and trembling as the burglar took her money and attempted to escape through the window right in front of her. The money that the burglar tried to steal was all she had, and she was keeping it for the baby that was growing inside her, which was the reason for her mom's rage in the first place. On the one hand, there was a voice that spoke to her in the last moment before she pulled the trigger. It told her, "Don't do it, it's wrong." And then there was my grandmother's voice saying, "Do it!" And the voice of the burglar on the other end of the barrel begging her, "Don't do it." It was then that my grandmother screamed at her, telling her that she was a useless coward. She no longer heard anything, neither the voice of the burglar nor the voice of her mom, not even the voice coming from within her. All that she heard was the sound of the gunshot that still rings loud in her ears even to this day. Nobody in the police station believed her when she told them that she didn't mean to do it, and all that she remembers was hearing all those voices, and then the image of the burglar lying in a pool of his own blood. The last words that my mom heard from her mom were, "You will always be a bad girl." And that was it. She was charged with murder, and she was sentenced to 35 years in prison. If she was lucky, she would get out of prison by the time she turned 40. But my mom isn't very lucky. You might be thinking, how could a 16-year-old girl be imprisoned while she was still a minor? So let me explain. There are 2 states that allow the imprisonment of those who are between 16 and 17 years of age, as they consider them to be adults. And as if that wasn't already bad enough, she also had to deal with having a mean mom, and at the same time, being 4 months pregnant. She had lived her whole life in a hostile environment, and now it looked like she would die in one too. Even if the place she was in was different, it wouldn't matter. There are bad people everywhere, whether inside or outside of prison. And as for me, well, my luck wasn't much better than my mom's was. I was in her womb throughout all of this. On her first day in prison, she screamed all day and night as she desperately needed some vitamins for her baby. She was extremely exhausted and afraid that her baby would die. Her baby was the only thing that was left for her. She had to scream at the top of her lungs over and over again until she no longer could, for them to finally ask her what she wanted. She screamed because she was alone, screamed because she was miserable, screamed because her dark thoughts had taken over her, screamed because of hunger, exhaustion, and pain. She screamed and screamed nonstop. And because she spent the last 5 months of her pregnancy screaming, no one knew that while it was just her 5th month in prison, it was actually her 9th month of pregnancy, and she was screaming because the time had come. Nobody knew that the time had come for her to give birth until I joined her in her screams when I was finally born. It didn't matter so much, though. The only difference was that the supervisor upsized her meals so that it would be enough for the 2 of us, and that the other prisoners looked out for Mom a bit more after she'd given birth. Although I don't have any memory of those tough days, I can honestly say that my mom's face was the only thing that kept me alive in the absence of the proper health care that a newborn like me needed. Prison was originally designed to break a person mentally, emotionally, and physically. My mom was pushed to the verge of madness while she was still a kid, but the only thing that kept whatever was left of her sanity intact was me. When I started to learn to talk, I learned the word grandmother from my mom. She used to tell me stories about my grandmother, who never visited us. My mom knew that I was the only family she had left, but I couldn't help thinking that somewhere behind the walls of the prison, I had a grandmother. It's fair to say that even though there was no blood relationship between me and the women and girls who were imprisoned with my mom, they were still like family to me. None of the guards cared about me, except one. Her name was Zoya. She had Russian roots and she used to bring me clothes and diapers. She was the one who gave me my name Vera, which means hope in Russian. She even taught me how to read and write when I turned 6, wanting to prepare me for the day on which I'd get out of prison to see a world I had no clue about. One day after she'd spent almost a whole day trying to convince me to sit and learn, I asked her, "Why would I learn to read and write if there's nothing for me to read or write about around here?" She answered, "Who said that there's nothing to read? There are millions of books out there that are full of stories and information about everything in the world." Then I was curious, so I asked, "And how can I get these books?" She said, "Tomorrow I will bring you some comic books." The next day, I waited by the cell gate holding onto the bars waiting for Zoya to come, but she never came. I sat day after day in the same spot waiting for her to show up, but she never did. Finally, I asked one of the guards who'd taken her place, and she told me that Zoya wasn't coming back. Eventually, the hope I'd had about getting the books started to fade, but that was far from the worst thing that was about to happen to me. My mom started treating me differently. She was moody all the time, and I could hear her crying all night. She no longer liked talking to me or sitting next to me while we ate. Can you imagine what it's like to be avoided by the only person you have in the whole world? I endured weeks and months of neglect. I didn't know what to do. One day I couldn't take it anymore. I was so mad about the way my relationship with my mom had changed. A woman who was a few years younger than my mom approached me and asked me to move away from the corner in which I was sitting because she wanted to sit in it. I refused, so she pushed me. I fell on the floor and cut my hand. I learned in prison that everyone wants to be the tough guy, so they won't fall victim to someone else who's stronger. Everyone struts around to show how tough they are, but I didn't need to prove how tough I was to anyone. Everyone treated me like a child, but suddenly they had all stopped doing that, and I didn't understand why. I couldn't just sit back and not do anything about what that woman had done to me, so I stood up, dusted myself off, and pushed her back. But she was so big. The rest of the prisoners surrounded us and started to chant, "Fight, fight, fight!" But the fight was over before it had even begun. Some prison guards approached us to break up the fight. One of them grabbed me by the hand and took me to the office of the chief prison warden. While we were on our way, and without any warning, she punched me in the chest. She treated me exactly like one of those prisoners. That punch somehow took my breath away, but I didn't fight back, as a prisoner's card always loses to the guard's card. I only looked at her with great anger and frustration. I looked around everywhere trying to find my mom, but I couldn't find her. Suddenly, my anger turned into gut-wrenching sobs. That guard saw the anger and misery burning in my eyes, so she looked at me and said, "Your eyes will get you in a lot of trouble. You have to understand that there's no place for you here, but if you ever want to have a chance of surviving outside these walls, you have to first survive inside. Life outside isn't that different from life in here." She extended her hand to shake mine, which in the prison world meant that she respected me. I went into the office of the chief prison warden. I saw a pile of papers in front of him. Photos of me and my mom were on top of it. I wasn't sat in front of him because of the fight. Instead, he was about to tell me the news that would change my entire life for the worse. "You are getting out of jail," he told me in a cold voice. He then said, "There's a family that is going to adopt you. You will go to school, and your life here will be a thing of the past." My life in that place would not only be a thing of the past, it would be over. Forever! The procedures were faster than I expected them to be. Within 2 hours, I had my stuff packed and I was waiting in front of the cell for the family that was adopting me. I sat there waiting for the unknown. Who was this family, and where were they taking me? And as for my mom, well, she didn't even show up to say goodbye. Why, though? A tall man wearing a suit and a short, fat woman who was wearing a colorful dress arrived. The way they looked was strange to me. Why is the lady wearing gloves? I asked myself. The weather wasn't cold. Let's just say that our first meeting was okay, but not exactly comforting. I didn't want to go with them, but I had no other choice. First, I'd been abandoned by Zoya, and then by my own mom. Prisons are supposed to rehabilitate the prisoners to help them give up on the emotions of anger and help them to start over with a new life. However, prison only taught me how to stay in a corner that was full of rage, desperation, and frustration. As a 7-year-old girl who had never had the chance to explore other sides of my personality, it was hard at first for me to get along with Mr. and Mrs. Thompson who'd adopted me. They were suspiciously calm. I felt like they were plotting something. But to my surprise, it turned out that being calm was the normal state of a human being and not the other way around, and that I was the one who was constantly in an abnormal state. After a while, I began to like them, but absolutely nothing was going to replace the love I had in my heart for my mom. We tried over and over again to visit my mom in prison, but she refused to see us every time we went to visit her. I came back from those visiting attempts every time with 1,000 questions in my mind. The only answer that Mrs. Thompson had for me was, "When you grow up, you will understand." I soon went to school, and guess what? There were a lot of books. I bought some of them for my classes, and there were so many in the library. But despite how happy I was about all these books that I could read, I felt sad for Zoya and my mom. I managed to make friends with some kids my own age, and I was very diligent at school. Everyone liked me, and I started to enjoy life outside the walls of prison. I started to spend most of my time at the library, but I always wished that my mom could be there too.
One day in college, I was sitting with some friends by the river and I started to have a panic attack. This had never happened to me before, so it totally freaked me out. The river was flowing really fast and one of my friends threw a rock across it, and that's when it happened. My whole body just started shaking and the sun felt too bright and I just wanted to scream. After I calmed down, I grabbed my bag and went back to my dorm. I was so embarrassed and I just needed to be alone for a bit. You see, all I wanted was to fit in. My whole life I'd been bounced around between foster homes, and only once I reached college did I finally have a room of my own. The first day was really hard though. Everyone's parents were dropping them off and helping them unpack, and I had no one. I guess you could say I'm an orphan. My mom died giving birth to me, and then my memories go kinda hazy, but there was an accident of some sort, and then I don't remember much. I must have knocked my head really badly because I don't know what happened to my dad. The man who found me after the accident and looked after me said my dad had died in the accident. I was so young at the time, so I didn't really understand. The only thing that sticks in my mind is that we all spoke Spanish together, and we laughed a lot. But the first foster home I was in said that wasn't a real memory, and that my name was Sarah, and I was clearly an English-speaking American. Well, now I was in college studying Spanish as a major, and my professor said I was the best student he'd ever had. I was so good that he came to me one day and said there was a summer program where I could go to Mexico and live with a host family and properly immerse myself in the language and culture. I told him I couldn't afford it, and he said he could arrange a bursary for me. I was so relieved, mainly because I had no plan of where to stay during the vacation time. I definitely wasn't going back to the foster home, and it's not like I had any family to go to. I just hoped the panic attacks stopped before then. Ever since that day at the river, they'd been getting worse and worse. I'd gone to the pool to watch my boyfriend in a swimming competition, and one guy had slipped and fallen in the pool, and I just watched in horror. I could barely breathe, and I think I panicked more than the guy. My boyfriend told me I needed to seriously chill out, and when I told him about the Mexico program, he said I should go for it. I thought he'd be sad that I would be gone for the summer, but he said he'd come visit me near the end and we could travel around together. A few days before I was due to leave, I got really nervous. I'd never traveled anywhere before, but I knew I had to do this. There was another girl, Alana, going with me, but she'd be staying with another host family. When we got there, the director of the program picked us up and drove us to our new homes for the summer. We dropped Alana off first, and I was so glad I wasn't in her position. It looked like her host family were dirt poor. Their house was tiny. I'd already seen photos of where I'd be staying, and it was definitely nicer, even better than some of the foster homes I'd been in. My host parents were waiting for me outside, and when they saw me, they came running over and started hugging me. It was so weird for me. I wasn't used to affection. They showed me around, and I was kind of disappointed it was just me and them. I was hoping for a host sister or brother. Alana at least had a host brother. She'd already texted me saying that he was a babe and that it didn't matter if they were poor, at least she had eye candy. She said we could all hang out the next day after class, and then I could meet him. At dinner that first night, my host parents kept looking at me, saying I looked like I belonged here, and they asked me if I felt at home. You know what? I did feel at home. The only thing bothering me was the sound of the river nearby. It was so loud, and I started to feel quite anxious. I was so tired after the flight, though, so I needed to sleep. A little while after I'd gone to bed, I heard voices. It must have been my host dad's friend. He sounded drunk, and I could hear him chatting away with my host dad for hours. At some point in the night, I heard my door open. I woke up straight away and realized the drunk man was standing there. I sat upright and asked what he wanted. Then he quickly walked out and said he was just looking for the bathroom. After that, I couldn't sleep. I was so creeped out. The next day was our first day of class, and Alana walked in with a big grin on her face. She winked at me and said that her and her host brother had gotten close last night, and that she hadn't had much sleep. I couldn't believe it. Her trip was way more exciting than mine so far, but at least my boyfriend was coming to visit in a month. After a whole day of classes, I was exhausted, but Alana's host brother Pedro was waiting outside to take us on a tour of the town. I introduced myself, and he wouldn't stop staring at me. I could see Alana was getting uncomfortable. She even hit him on the arm and said, "Why not just take a picture? It'll last longer." And then he laughed and said, "Sorry, she just looks so familiar." It was pretty odd. He kept staring at me the whole afternoon. Eventually, Alana said she was feeling sick and asked to go home, and Pedro dropped her off. Then he said he'd drive me home too because it was too hot to walk. Alana, of course, was not happy about this and gave me an evil glance as she got out. I had to ask him to keep his eyes on the road as he was constantly staring at me. "Listen, Pedro, I have a boyfriend. I'm not single, okay?" And he laughed and said he wasn't attracted to me. I just looked like someone he used to go to school with. Then he asked about my family, and I said it was just me, and he looked confused. "What do you mean, just you?" he asked. And I explained I'd spent my whole life in foster homes and didn't have a family. Then he reached out and gave me a hug and said, "We are your family now." Wow, these Mexicans were full on. I mean, I just met this guy today. The next day was my birthday, and I thought maybe Alana and I could do something fun to celebrate. But then Alana arrived at class with her suitcase. I apologized for the day before, thinking she was leaving because she thought Pedro liked me, but it turned out to be much worse. Her mom was sick, and she needed to go back to America. I couldn't believe it. We'd only been here one day. I wasn't ready to be here all on my own. After classes finished, Pedro was taking Alana to the airport, and Alana turned to me and said, "Just remember you have a boyfriend, Sarah." Then she left without saying goodbye or happy birthday. Unbelievable. Well, I hoped her mom would be okay at least. I went home and my host parents were waiting with a big cake and balloons, and I was so happy to see them. I assumed it was just the three of us celebrating, but then the creepy drunk man from the day before appeared, and he looked so grumpy. Great, not what I wanted on my birthday. When my host parents started singing happy birthday, he walked out. He was so rude. I looked at my host dad, and he just shrugged his shoulders and apologized. He said it was a difficult day for his friend. The rest of the evening, he just stayed outside smoking and looking at the river. It was so... I offered him a piece of cake, and he just asked me to leave him alone. When I came back inside, I asked my host parents what his problem was, and they told me his daughter had died years ago and he'd never really recovered. I knew that must have been hard, but I'd lost my whole family and I wasn't going around being mean to people. Why today, of all days? It was my birthday, which meant it was also the day my mom had died, so it wasn't an easy day for me either. After that, I just wanted to be on my own, so I went to bed and called my boyfriend. A little while later, I heard someone singing and I got goosebumps. I knew that song. It was one of my favorite Spanish songs, and I realized it was coming from outside. I peered outside my window and couldn't believe it. It was the grumpy guy singing. I felt kind of bad for how I'd complained about him to my boyfriend, so I went downstairs and told him I liked the song and that he had a nice voice. He was clearly drunk again because he just looked at me. I thought he'd at least say thanks, but I realized he'd been crying, and then he just walked off. I decided to follow him. I was so worried he'd fall in the river or something. "Hey, let me walk with you," I called after him. I then caught up with him and grabbed his arm just before he tripped and fell. There was something about this man that made me curious, especially because of that song. I hadn't listened to it in years because it always made me emotional. I wanted to make him feel better, so I told him today wasn't the best day for me either. I didn't think he was really listening, but I felt like I could connect with this man. We both lost people we loved, and that wasn't easy. We reached the river, and he still hadn't spoken to me. He didn't even acknowledge what I'd said. He just sat down, lit up a cigarette, and then started crying. He was saying something about how she would have been 19 years old today and how it was all his fault. I asked him what he meant, and he said he'd been the reason she died. And then he told me his son had also left him, that he'd gone to live in another city because he couldn't stand being around his grumpy father. I mean, I couldn't blame the son, but also that's hard. Now he was here all alone, and I definitely know what that feels like. Suddenly, he just got up and walked away, and I decided to sit by the river for a bit. It was really late, but for some reason there were still some kids playing on the other side of the river. Out of nowhere, I felt that tightness in my chest again. Why was this happening? I really felt like I couldn't breathe, so I lay down down and tried to take deep breaths, and then it hit me. Another full-on panic attack. I must have passed out because the next moment I was waking up in some kind of hospital bed, and my host parents were there holding my hands. The doctor came in and said I'd be okay, and that maybe I just fell and knocked my head, but I knew that wasn't what had happened. I just didn't know how to tell him that water made me anxious and gave me panic attacks. It must have been about 2 a.m. by that point, and I told my host parents to go home and get some sleep, but they said no way, they weren't leaving my side. Suddenly, I wondered who'd found me, and they said it was Manuel. "Who's Manuel?" I asked, and they laughed and said, "Our old grumpy friend, didn't he tell you his name?" It dawned on me that I hadn't even bothered to ask his name. I couldn't believe he'd saved me like that. "Where is he?" I asked, and they said he'd been in shock and gone home. He hated hospitals, too many bad memories, and I couldn't argue with that. When I got out of the hospital later that morning, I went home to rest at my host parents', and Manuel was there. He was carrying some flowers, and he apologized for treating me badly. I told him it was okay and thanked him for saving me, and then he asked if I wanted to see photos of his little girl. Before I could even reply, he pulled out an album and started showing me baby photos, and then the last one he ever took of this girl, and it felt like I was about to have another panic attack, except it wasn't because I was anxious. The little girl in the photos